Hello, everyone. My name is Govind Gopakumar, and I'm an associate professor at the Center for Engineering and Society, and I'm going to be talking today about social innovation. Now, when we hear the word innovation, we get a sense that it's associated with new technologies and new gadgets entering the market. And that's part of the story. Innovation is a process of technological change, but what is interesting about it is that it is rooted in processes of social and economic development. It has to be, in some sense, tied with contexts of society and economy. And this process of application within a social and economic context is what gives value to technology. And so the difference between innovation versus invention is that while invention is in some sense the novel application of knowledge, innovation is using that knowledge, those inventions, and then applying it within specific contexts of economy and society. Now, why is innovation important? Because it is what keeps different firms in our economy afloat. The ability to innovate is what allows these firms to stay ahead. There are four kinds of innovation, so the four P's of innovation: product innovation, position innovation, process innovation, and paradigm innovation. Now, the key point we want to make in the context of a lecture on social innovation is the notion of inclusive innovation. As the term implies, inclusive innovation is the form of creation and absorption and distribution of knowledge and technology that is targeted to directly meet the needs of low-income population. But it's not, although this is the World Bank definition, it needn't just be low-income population. It could be populations that are in some ways excluded from mainstream innovation processes and pathways. Now, those could be low-income groups. It could be minority groups that could be racial, ethnic, or other visible minority groups. It could also be language minority groups. All of these groups that consider themselves excluded from the mainstream, and targeting innovation efforts specifically to those groups is part of the agenda of inclusive innovation. So in the context of thinking about inclusive innovation, it's also important to bear in mind that there are multiple ways of trying to address the needs of these populations through mainstream pathways as well as through alternative pathways. Now, alternative pathways are what we're going to be focusing on primarily through the notion of social innovation. But it's also important to understand what mainstream pathways are. Mainstream pathways could be of two kinds: large public or university research processes, as well as corporate research and development efforts. Now, each of these efforts have their own distinctive ways of doing things. So public university innovation is by and large funded by major federal, provincial research agencies, and also research funding agencies that fund uh, the majority of university research that's conducted around the world, not just in Canada, in universities around the world. And so this is a schematic of federal and provincial research and development processes and groups that are involved in it. So Canada spends about 2% of the GDP on research and development, and this compares with several other OECD countries. It's not one of the highest, but neither is it one of the lowest. And so if you look at sources of research funding in Canada, about half of the national spending on research and development is supported by public sources, and slightly more than half is through business and commercial corporate funding. So corporate R&D, again, that's research and development that is primarily funded through by the interests of industry and other major corporations. It has three kinds: basic research, applied research, and then processes of development, which the process of development is actually what is tied much more closely with processes of innovation. Now, of late, people have been talking about the notion of a triple helix, where the mainstream innovation agenda has come together in some sense, rather than looking at it separately as government, university, and industry. The triple helix model talks about how is it that we can do research and development in a very collaborative fashion that leverages the kind of synergies of involving these three entities: government, university, and industry. And there are several ways of doing that, and increasingly one hears of ventures such as incubators, research joint ventures, and partnership efforts, industrial partnership efforts that are present in not just in Canada but around the world, where they seek to get government sources of funding in partnership with industrial groups and directed towards university. And so it creates a process where multiple actors are involved in the process of research. But at the same time, despite all the sophistication associated with mainstream pathways, one still finds a need for alternative pathways. And one of the biggest reasons for alternative pathways is that mainstream pathways have their own drawbacks associated with the kind of research that is being done. For example, um, public funding of research and innovation is often, although it supposedly promotes social interests and the public interest, and more often than not is promotes kind of bureaucratic and political interests. There are also market imperfections that are associated with industrial research and development processes. And that market imperfection is primarily related to the fact that much of the research needs to advance the financial bottom line of the industry or the corporation. And if that research does not advance the bottom line, then it could be considered risky, and it would be something that is not followed by the industry because they do not see an interest in doing that. And so, as a result of these multiple kinds of problems associated with mainstream pathways, there's been a lot of focus on innovations that can create social value for diverse groups in society. And this is where inclusive innovation comes in, because this is innovation that's targeted specifically at people who feel excluded from the mainstream agenda. And so, who does alternative innovation? And the answer, to put it very simply, is civil society. Now, when you think of civil society, you usually think of civil society as activists. I think the picture is slightly more complicated than that. It's certainly activists and nonprofit organizations are certainly important parts of civil society, but that's not the only picture, certainly not with regards to social innovation. So, what is civil society? Civil society is being considered the third sector. In some ways, that is different from market, that is different from the government, and it's different from households or individual families. And so it occupies a kind of a third space which overlaps between major fault lines, for want of a better word, major divisions that exist in society, between public and private, between profit and non-profit, and between formal and informal. Now, I don't want to introduce these concepts to make it much more difficult for students to understand, but let's just think of civil society as this third sector, as a sector that is separate from market and the state. And the civil society brings a particular perspective and a particular role in society. It forges kind of people-to-people contacts. It's a so-called independent voice that is independent of the public agencies as well as of market industry corporations. And more importantly, and of relevance to the lecture, is that it provides an alternative pathway to technological development and innovation. So how does one do this kind of innovation? Well, you need to create the right conditions, and providing those right conditions are certainly a major role is the role of the government and political will to support a broader sense of innovation and entrepreneurship. You also must have a more open business environment that nurtures these smaller ventures, these smaller kind of grassroots ventures, which may or may not be very profitable in the initial stages at least. And so people have written about this. And so people speak of creating something like an innovation engine, and also kind of radically different pathways to scale these ideas into larger society. And so by that, I mean, I don't want to go into more detail. So innovation engine is an effort to kind of bring multiple kinds of youth, a diversity of disciplines, a diversity of cultures, and to actually get them to think about science and engineering and to think about innovation much more broadly. And so by doing that, you get a diversity of people, a diversity of ideas, a diversity of interests, and that is a very healthy thing in trying to innovate. We also require different kinds of pathways to scale, so different kinds of business models and different forms of investments that can drive social enterprises. So one thing to bear in mind is that alternative innovation leads to appropriate technologies that are appropriate to local context and are appropriate to local know-how as well as utilize local materials. And so Engineers Without Borders, which all of us are familiar with, promotes this kind of appropriate technology. And so one of the photos that you have on this slide is of an innovation that Engineers Without Borders was actively involved, the multifunctional machine. And this was promoted in Africa as a means of creating livelihoods and resulting in improvement in lifestyle of people in Africa. So there are multiple ways of doing these alternative pathways, and I want to speak very briefly about these. So you could be a revolutionary pioneer. In some sense, you're motivated by an intellectual challenge. You think very out of the box in coming up with radically different innovations that has the potential to address niche areas which so far have been excluded from the regular innovation process. You also have groups like tinkerers and hobbyists who are motivated by a love of doing, the tinkering that they enjoy so much. And they operate within a community of like-minded people, and they share their innovations and inventions, and very often, something really interesting comes out of these efforts. There's also user-driven innovation, where the motivation is to solve problems of using technology on a daily basis. And so bringing about kind of functional improvement. Often these efforts are amateurish in the early stages, but they address problems in a very radically, by revisioning them in very interesting ways. And that can spur larger efforts and more broader efforts to improve on the functioning of devices and products. There's also another form of innovation is cultural adaptation that you find in different cultural contexts, of kind of appropriating devices and then applying them to make them more suitable for different contexts. And then finally, social innovators. Now, social innovators are motivated by a very clear agenda for social and environmental value generation. There are different groups that can be part of social innovation. In fact, I call it a spectrum of social innovation. And so you can go all the way from very activist groups who are associated with social movements towards voluntary non-profit organizations, as well as on the professional side, social entrepreneurships. And it's this spectrum of social innovation that makes it such a vibrant field for bringing out uh, products, processes, innovation very broadly that tries to address particular social values of exclusion and bring different groups into the mainstream. So, what is social entrepreneurship? Entrepreneurship that has a very clear focus on social and environmental value generation. And in the process of doing that, they develop alternative models of technological development that are alternate from the mainstream approaches to developing technologies. Now, one of the things that social entrepreneurs do is that they're not only motivated by generating social and environmental value, but they're also very broad based in their networking. And so they're active not just in the civil society, in third sector, but also across private and public sectors. And so they try to leverage their connections across these multiple sectors to actually bring about interesting forms of social and technological change in society. A good example